April 4, 1945, near the Ruhr Pocket, Germany. Dawn broke over frozen fields littered with abandoned equipment and wounded men. American forces had just closed the encirclement around more than 300,000 German troops, the largest surrender on the Western Front since D-Day. In field hospitals hastily erected behind advancing front lines, exhausted medics worked without pause. Among the wounded flooding their tents were not just American soldiers, but hundreds of captured Germans, many grievously injured, some barely clinging to life. German soldiers, taught to expect execution or abandonment, now found themselves receiving morphine, sulfur powder, and blood transfusions from their enemies. American medics, bound by the Geneva Convention and their own medical oath, saw no uniforms, only wounded men who needed help. What followed would challenge both armies' understanding of war, mercy, and the value of human life itself. March 7th through April 1st, 1945. The Rhine River, Germany. The war in Europe entered its final brutal phase. Soviet forces pressed westward from the east, while Anglo-American armies surged across the Rhine from the west, crushing Nazi Germany between two unstoppable forces. When American troops of the 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7th, they opened a gateway into the industrial heartland of the Third Reich, the Ruhr region. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group poured through this breach. To the north, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group, including the American 9th Army, crossed the Rhine near Wesel on March 23rd in Operation Plunder. Supported by massive airborne drops, the two prongs of this enormous pincer movement raced across German soil, their tanks grinding forward through shattered towns and demoralized Wehrmacht units. The German Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model, found itself trapped. Model had once been Hitler's favorite troubleshooter, the commander who could stabilize any crisis. But by April of 1945, even Model's tactical brilliance could not overcome impossible odds. His forces consisted largely of exhausted veterans, poorly trained Volksgrenadier militia, teenage Hitler Youth members, and elderly Volkssturm Home Guard units, men as young as 12 and as old as 60, many armed with obsolete weapons or no weapons at all. On April 1st, advance elements of Bradley's 1st Army and the 9th Army met near Lippstadt, east of the Ruhr. The trap was sprung. Some 317,000 German soldiers now found themselves encircled in what would become known as the Ruhr Pocket, the largest encirclement battle on the Western Front of World War II. For comparison, the German disaster at Stalingrad had cost them about 250,000 men. The Ruhr Pocket would prove even more devastating. Inside the pocket, chaos reigned. German supply lines had collapsed. Ammunition was scarce, fuel almost non-existent. Hitler, still directing operations from his bunker in Berlin, forbade any breakout attempts or surrenders. He demanded that Fortress Ruhr hold out for months, tying down Allied divisions. Model knew such orders were suicidal fantasies, but German military tradition demanded obedience. For the Americans, victory was certain, but not yet complete. Bradley's forces began systematic attacks to reduce the pocket, dividing it into smaller segments. Each attack produced casualties on both sides. American medics, who had learned their brutal trade in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and the Battle of the Bulge, prepared for another surge of wounded. What they did not fully anticipate was the sheer number of German prisoners who would need medical care. The Geneva Convention, revised in 1929, clearly stated that wounded prisoners of war must receive the same medical treatment as a belligerent's own forces. American military medical doctrine had been built on this principle since before Pearl Harbor. Every Army medic carried a small card explaining Geneva Convention protections for medical personnel, protections that theoretically exempted them from combat and required enemy forces to respect the Red Cross emblem, but doctrine and reality often diverged on the battlefield. Medics had learned that not all enemies respected Geneva protections. In the Pacific, Japanese forces rarely honored Red Cross markings, often targeting medics deliberately. In Europe, regular Wehrmacht units generally followed the conventions, but SS units frequently did not. American medics had witnessed German troops firing on clearly marked ambulances and field hospitals during the Battle of the Bulge just 4 months earlier. Now, as tens of thousands of German soldiers began surrendering in the Ruhr Pocket, American medical units faced an unprecedented logistical challenge. These were not healthy prisoners who could be marched to rear area camps. Thousands were wounded, many critically. German military medical services had collapsed along with the Wehrmacht's command structure. The responsibility for treating these men would fall entirely on American medical units already stretched to their limits. April 1945, field hospitals across the Ruhr region. To understand what happened next requires understanding who the American combat medic was and what he believed. The United States Army Medical Department had developed a sophisticated battlefield medical system over 4 years of global warfare. At its front line were the combat medics, young men, most in their late teens or early 20s, who had volunteered or been assigned to save lives rather than take them. A typical infantry battalion of 400 to 500 men included approximately 30 medics, though attrition often reduced that number. These men received 4 to 6 months of medical training covering basic battlefield medicine, controlling hemorrhage, treating shock, applying dressings, splinting fractures, and administering morphine for pain. They learned triage, the grim art of deciding who could be saved and who was beyond help. They studied field sanitation, disease prevention, and how to function under fire. The medic's job was not to perform surgery or provide definitive medical care. His mission was stabilization and evacuation. Stop the bleeding, treat for shock, prevent infection with sulfur powder, give morphine for pain, prepare the wounded for transport to battalion aid stations, then clearing stations, then field or evacuation hospitals where surgeons could perform life-saving operations. Combat medics carried distinctive equipment. On their helmets and armbands, they wore the Red Cross, the international symbol of medical neutrality established by the original Geneva Convention of 1864. In their medical bags, they carried bandages, tourniquets, morphine syrettes, sulfur powder, plasma for treating shock, and basic instruments. They carried no weapons, at least not officially. The Geneva Convention designated them as non-combatants who could not engage in offensive combat. This weaponless status created terrible dilemmas. When comrades were dying and the medic was the only man available to return fire, what should he do? When wounded men needed protection from enemy soldiers who did not respect Geneva protections, how could an unarmed medic help them? Many medics, particularly in the Pacific Theater, eventually carried pistols or carbines for self-defense, though this technically forfeited their protected status. European theater medics generally adhered more strictly to non-combatant protocols. What never changed was their fundamental mission: get to the wounded, stabilize them, evacuate them. Under fire, through minefields and across rivers, the cry of "medic" brought these young men running toward danger rather than away from it. Behind the combat medics stood a sophisticated medical chain. Battalion aid stations, usually in houses or cellars a few hundred yards behind the front, provided the first level of physician care. Here, battalion surgeons performed emergency procedures, stopping arterial bleeding, treating chest wounds, emergency amputations when necessary. Men stabilized at aid stations were evacuated to regimental collecting stations, then to division clearing stations. Clearing stations represented the next level of sophistication. Here, medical teams performed triage on a larger scale, separating walking wounded who could return to duty from serious cases requiring hospitalization. From clearing stations, casualties moved to field hospitals, mobile surgical units that could set up complete operating rooms in tents within hours. The most seriously wounded went to evacuation hospitals farther behind the lines, large installations with hundreds of beds, multiple operating rooms, and specialized medical staff. From there, those needing long-term care were transported by hospital train, hospital ship, or medical aircraft. This entire chain had been refined through years of combat experience. The American medical system's effectiveness showed in the numbers. In World War I, the death rate among wounded American soldiers who reached medical care was approximately 8%. By World War II, that rate had fallen to approximately 4%. Better training, better equipment, faster evacuation, sulfur drugs, penicillin, blood plasma, all contributed. For every 100 American soldiers wounded in Europe who received medical care, 96 survived. This system had been designed primarily for American casualties. Now it would be tested by an unexpected demand. Thousands of enemy wounded who had become American responsibility through surrender and the requirements of international law, April 5th through 8th, 1945, multiple locations within the Ruhr Pocket. The first large groups of wounded German prisoners arrived at American medical units in the days following the pocket's closure. What happened next would be remembered by participants on both sides for the rest of their lives. Private First Class James Anderson, a medic with the 4th Infantry Division, later described the scene at his battalion aid station on April 6th. They started bringing in Germans around noon, some walking, some on stretchers. I'd never seen men in that condition. Wounds gone septic because they'd had no medical care for days. Guys with broken bones that had never been set. One fellow had taken shrapnel to the abdomen 3 days earlier, and it was a miracle he was still alive. German medical services had effectively ceased to function. Wehrmacht field hospitals had been overrun or forced to evacuate. German medics had run out of supplies or been captured. Many German wounded had simply been abandoned as units retreated or surrendered. When these men fell into American hands, they expected nothing. Some expected execution. Nazi propaganda had told them Americans massacred prisoners, Others expected to be left to die. What they received instead shocked them. Technical Sergeant Robert Miller, a surgical technician with the 45th Evacuation Hospital, recalled the first wave of German casualties. Our policy was simple. We treated them the same as our own. Same triage protocols, same medications, same surgical procedures. If a German and an American came in with similar wounds at the same time, we treated based on medical priority, not nationality. The doctors were clear about that from day one. This policy reflected both Geneva Convention requirements and American military medical doctrine. The Surgeon General's office had issued clear directives. Enemy wounded would receive medical care equivalent to that provided to American forces. This was not humanitarian sentiment alone, though many medics felt such sentiments. It was military policy based on reciprocity. The United States wanted its own prisoners treated properly by enemy forces and therefore would treat enemy prisoners properly. The practical challenges were immense. American medical units were already strained caring for their own casualties. Now they faced thousands of additional patients, many in worse condition than American wounded because they had received no initial treatment. Supply lines struggled to keep up. Morphine, sulfur powder, bandages, plasma, surgical instruments, all were in limited supply and now had to be shared between American and German wounded. Medics made difficult decisions. Technical Sergeant William Harrison, with the 2nd Armored Division Medical Battalion, described the moral calculation. You'd have a German and an American, both gut shot, both critical. You couldn't save both, not enough time, not enough plasma. What do? Our doc said treat whoever has the better chance of survival, regardless of uniform. That's what we did. Sometimes that meant treating the German first. Some of our boys didn't like it, but the docs were in charge. Language barriers complicated treatment. Few American medics spoke German. Few German prisoners spoke English. Medical personnel relied on gestures, on basic medical examination, on the universal language of pain and need. Some American units were fortunate to have German-speaking personnel, immigrants, sons of immigrants, or soldiers who had studied German in school. These men became invaluable as translators during triage and treatment. German prisoners' reactions varied. Some remained sullen and uncooperative, still clinging to Nazi indoctrination that taught them Americans were brutal enemies. Many more expressed bewilderment and gratitude. They had been told Americans would kill prisoners, yet here were American medics giving them morphine, bandaging their wounds, performing surgery to save their lives. Corporal Ernst Weber, a Wehrmacht infantryman captured near Dortmund with a severe leg wound, later testified about his experience. I thought I would die. My leg was broken, infected. I had not eaten in 2 days. The American medic who found me gave me water, gave me injection for pain. At the aid station, they put me on a surgical table. The American doctor operated on my leg. He saved my leg, saved my life. This I did not expect. I had been told Americans showed no mercy. The volume of German wounded created logistical nightmares. Battalion aid stations designed to handle dozens of casualties now processed hundreds. Field hospitals intended for American soldiers now operated at double or triple capacity. Medical supply officers requisitioned additional stocks of everything: morphine, sulfur, bandages, plasma, splints, surgical instruments. Some American medical units established separate treatment areas for German prisoners, not from any desire to provide inferior care, but from practical necessity. German prisoners had to be guarded, and keeping them in designated areas simplified security. Other units mixed American and German wounded in the same wards and tents, treating patients as they arrived without segregation. Not everyone approved of treating enemy wounded. Some American soldiers questioned why scarce medical resources were being used to save men who had been trying to kill Americans days or hours earlier. Technical Sergeant Miller recalled arguments at his evacuation hospital. A couple infantrymen came through, saw Germans getting surgery and raised hell, said it was wrong to waste American medicine on Nazis. One of our surgeons told them flat out, "I'm a doctor, I treat patients, I don't care what uniform they wore." That shut them up. April 6th through 9th, 1945, throughout the collapsing Ruhr Pocket. As American forces continued squeezing the pocket, combat intensified. German resistance, while ultimately futile, remained fierce in some sectors. Both sides took casualties. American medical units worked around the clock. First Lieutenant Charles Davidson, a battalion surgeon with the 26th Infantry Regiment, described a typical day during the battle. We set up in a damaged farmhouse basement. Operating table was a door laid across sawhorses. Lighting came from vehicle headlights aimed through the windows. We'd work 12, 14, 16 hours straight. Americans, Germans, didn't matter. Whoever came through those doors got treatment. The medical procedures were brutal by civilian standards, but life-saving under battlefield conditions. Triage determined who got immediate care. Category 1, immediate surgery required to survive. Category 2, serious but can wait. Category 3, minor wounds, can return to duty. Category 4, beyond help, make comfortable. Combat medics perform this sorting rapidly, often in seconds, a glance at the wound, a check of vital signs, a decision. Category 1 patients went straight to the surgical area. Those requiring blood transfusions received them immediately. Plasma, the liquid portion of blood without cells, could be administered without blood type matching and was used extensively to treat shock from blood loss. Sulfur drugs represented one of the war's great medical advances. Sulfanilamide powder, sprinkled directly into wounds, dramatically reduced infection rates. Before sulfur, minor wounds often became gangrenous, requiring amputation or causing death. With sulfur, infection rates dropped by more than half. Every medic carried sulfur powder and applied it liberally to every wound. Morphine controlled pain and prevented shock. Medics carried morphine in syrettes, single-dose injectors resembling small toothpaste tubes with an attached needle. Push the needle into the patient's thigh or arm, squeeze the tube, and relief came within minutes. Medics marked morphine administration by attaching the empty syrette to the patient's collar or writing an M on the patient's forehead, preventing accidental overdose. Surgical procedures in field conditions were crude but effective. Speed mattered more than sterility, though surgeons took reasonable precautions. Anesthesia was usually ether or pentothal. Operations focused on life-saving interventions, stopping hemorrhage, removing shrapnel, debriding damaged tissue, repairing perforated organs, amputating unsalvageable limbs. German wounded required the same procedures as American wounded: gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, blast trauma, broken bones, burns. The weapons didn't discriminate, and neither did the doctors. If anything, German prisoners often arrived in worse condition than American casualties because of delayed treatment. This made operations more difficult, outcomes less certain, but surgeons did their best. Private First Class Martin Schulz, a Wehrmacht machine gunner captured with multiple shrapnel wounds, survived because of American medical care. In a post-war interview, he described his injuries and treatment. "I was hit in the chest, arm and leg. I could not walk. My comrades left me. They had to. We were retreating. I lay for many hours, perhaps 8 or 10, I don't know. American soldiers found me. They gave me injection for pain. At hospital, American doctor removed the metal from my chest. Without this surgery, I would have died." Statistics from American medical units show the scale of this effort. The 45th Evacuation Hospital, operating near Marburg during the Ruhr battle, treated approximately 800 patients between April 1st and April 18th. Roughly 40% were German prisoners. Of the German wounded treated, approximately 65% survived their initial injuries and hospitalization. The survival rate among severely wounded Germans treated by American medical units exceeded what German military medicine had achieved for its own troops earlier in the war. Several factors contributed. American medical units were better supplied, American doctors were better trained, American evacuation systems were faster and more efficient, and American medications, particularly sulfur drugs, plasma, and penicillin, were more abundant. Penicillin, the wonder drug of World War II, was available to American forces in quantities German forces could only dream of. By 1945, American pharmaceutical companies were producing penicillin in massive quantities. It saved thousands of lives by curing infections that would have been fatal in any previous war. German military forces had virtually no access to penicillin. For German wounded now in American hands, this meant infections that would have killed them in German hospitals could be cured. Not all German wounded survived. Some arrived too late, their wounds too severe, their bodies too weak from days without treatment. Category 4. Triage patients received morphine for pain but no active treatment. Medical resources were too scarce to waste on men who could not be saved. These men died in American field hospitals, but they died without unnecessary suffering, which was more than many would have received in the chaos of the collapsing Wehrmacht. April 7th through 10th, 1945. Evacuation routes throughout the Ruhr region. Treating wounded prisoners was only half the challenge. Moving them from battalion aid stations to hospitals, then from field hospitals to evacuation hospitals, required a functioning transportation system under combat conditions. American medical evacuation used dedicated ambulances, converted jeeps with litter racks, and commandeered vehicles. The standard ambulance was the WC-54 Dodge, a 3/4-ton truck modified to carry 4-liter patients or 7 ambulatory patients. These vehicles bore large Red Cross markings and theoretically enjoyed protected status under the Geneva Convention. In practice, ambulances faced numerous hazards. German artillery didn't always distinguish medical vehicles from combat vehicles, especially when both used the same roads. Air attacks threatened all vehicles. Mines endangered any off-road travel. Mechanical breakdowns plagued overworked ambulances driving day and night over damaged roads. Transporting German wounded created additional complications. Wounded prisoners required guards, even when they were too injured to pose any threat. Security procedures dictated that German prisoners travel separately from American wounded when possible, requiring dedicated medical transport runs. This doubled the transportation burden. Technical Sergeant Edward Morrison, a motor pool officer with the 99th Medical Battalion, described the logistics. We'd run ambulances forward empty, load up with casualties, sometimes Americans, sometimes Germans, sometimes both, and run back to the clearing station or field hospital, then turn around and do it again. Drivers were going 20 hours a day. We were wearing out vehicles faster than maintenance could fix them. The distance from battlefield to field hospital often exceeded 10 miles, over damaged roads with wounded men crying out at every bump. These journeys could take an hour or more. Speed mattered. The faster a critically wounded patient reached a surgical facility, the better his chances. The U.S. Army called this the golden hour, though the term wouldn't become official doctrine until later wars. Getting patients from point of injury to surgery within 1 hour dramatically improved survival rates. The volume of German wounded overwhelmed normal evacuation procedures. Medical units improvised. Cargo trucks became ambulances. Captured German vehicles were pressed into service. In some cases, walking wounded Germans, under guard, walked the miles to collection points rather than consuming scarce transportation resources. First Lieutenant Robert Hennessy, a medical evacuation officer, described the sorting process. We'd get 50-75 men at the clearing station. Americans and Germans mixed together. We'd sort by medical priority and by destination. Americans to American field hospitals, Germans to designated POW wards. If facilities were full, everyone went wherever space existed. The system was barely controlled chaos. Some German wounded ended up in the same hospital wards as American wounded, not from any idealistic integration policy, but from practical necessity. These men needed hospitalization immediately, and there were no separate facilities available. Surgeons operated on whoever needed surgery. Ward nurses cared for whoever occupied the beds. Captain Rebecca Jameson, an Army nurse with the 28th Evacuation Hospital, remembered the ward she supervised in mid-April. We had Americans, Germans, even a few French civilians caught in the crossfire. They lay in rows of cots, everyone hurt, everyone scared. The Germans didn't cause trouble. They were grateful for care, grateful to be alive. I remember one German boy, he couldn't have been more than 17, kept saying, "Danke, danke, thank you," over and over. Medical supplies flowed forward through the same logistics system that supplied combat troops. Medical supply companies maintained stocks of everything from bandages to X-ray film. When supplies ran short, medical officers requisitioned emergency stocks from Army and Corps depots. The U.S. Army's logistics system, the most sophisticated the world had ever seen, ensured that medical units rarely faced true shortages, though specific items might be scarce for hours or days. German wounded consumed American medical supplies. This was inevitable and accepted. The alternative, letting prisoners die from lack of treatment, was unacceptable under international law and American medical ethics. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, had made this clear to his medical officers. Treat prisoners according to Geneva Convention requirements, and the Army would provide necessary resources. April 8th through 10th, 1945, throughout American-held areas of the Ruhr. Not everyone agreed with the policy of treating German wounded. The question of why American resources should be used to save enemy soldiers sparked debates in aid stations, field hospitals, and command posts. Combat infantrymen, men who had fought Germans for months or years, men who had watched friends die from German bullets and shells, sometimes questioned the morality of saving enemy lives. Private First Class Thomas Bradford, recovering from shrapnel wounds in an evacuation hospital, voiced what many soldiers felt. "I'm lying here with half my squad dead, and they're using American medicine to save the bastards who killed them. Don't seem right?" Medical personnel understood these feelings, but maintained their professional standards. Captain Michael Thompson, a surgeon who had operated continuously for 3 days during the heaviest fighting, explained his view. "I took an oath when I became a doctor. Do no harm, treat the sick. I didn't take an oath to treat only Americans or only people I agree with. These German soldiers didn't start the war. Most of them didn't want to be here any more than we did. They're wounded. I'm a surgeon. It's that simple." Army chaplains wrestled with theological dimensions. Father Patrick O'Malley, a Catholic chaplain with the 3rd Armored Division, discussed the moral question in his diary. "Christ taught us to love our enemies. Yet, our enemies have committed terrible crimes. How do we reconcile mercy with justice?" I believe we show mercy through medical care while reserving justice for war crimes tribunals. The wounded German soldier in our aid station is not responsible for Dachau or Buchenwald. He deserves medical treatment. Jewish American soldiers and medical personnel faced particularly complex feelings. Many had relatives in Europe, relatives now known to be dead in Nazi concentration camps. Technical Sergeant David Rosenberg, a surgical technician whose family had fled Poland in 1938, described his internal conflict. "I knew what Hitler had done to the Jews. My cousins were dead, murdered. Now I'm assisting surgery on German soldiers. Part of me wanted to walk away, let them die, but I couldn't. I'd sworn to help the wounded, so I did my job. I saved German lives. I'm still not sure how I feel about that." The discovery of concentration camps in April of 1945 intensified these moral dilemmas. As Allied forces liberated Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and other camps, newsreels and photographs documented atrocities beyond imagination. Soldiers and medics learned that the enemy they had been fighting represented a regime of unprecedented evil. Yet the wounded Germans in American hospitals were individual soldiers, most of them conscripts, most claiming no knowledge of the camps. Major Harold Brewster, a hospital commander, addressed his staff about this issue. "We've all seen the photographs from the camps. They're sickening beyond words. But look at the German prisoners in our wards. Most are teenagers or old men. They didn't run the camps. They may not have even known about them. Our job is to treat the wounded, not to judge their nation's crimes. Justice will come at war crimes trials. Our job is medicine." Some medical personnel refused to treat Germans. These refusals were rare, but did occur. In 2 documented cases, medics or nurses requested reassignment rather than care for German patients. Their requests were generally granted without punitive action. The Army recognized the psychological burden. More commonly, American medical personnel treated German wounded professionally while harboring personal resentment. They did their jobs because military duty and medical ethics required it, not from any sense of compassion for individual Germans. Captain Elizabeth Warner, an Army nurse, expressed this attitude. "Did I like treating Germans? No. Did I do it? Yes, because that's what nurses do. I wasn't betraying our soldiers. I was upholding American values, the values we were fighting to defend." German prisoners' reactions complicated these moral calculations. Many German wounded expressed genuine gratitude for American medical care. They thanked doctors, nurses, and medics. They praised American humanity. They contrasted their treatment in American hospitals with how they expected to be treated. Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann, wounded during the Ruhr battle and treated at an American field hospital, later wrote about his experience. "I had been told Americans were savages, that they tortured prisoners. Instead, the American doctor who operated on me saved my life. The American nurses cared for me with kindness. This experience changed my understanding of the war. I realized my government had lied about many things." April 10th through 14th, 1945, various medical facilities in the Ruhr region. As days passed and more data accumulated, American medical officers began analyzing outcomes for German wounded. The results surprised many observers. Of German prisoners requiring immediate surgical intervention, the most seriously wounded, approximately 60 to 65% survived their initial injuries and hospitalization. This rate equaled or exceeded survival rates for similarly wounded American soldiers. Several factors explained this unexpected success. First, German wounded who reached American medical care received treatment superior to what German military medicine could provide by April 1945. American field hospitals had ample supplies, trained surgeons, functioning equipment, and rapid evacuation to higher-level hospitals. German medical units, by contrast, had collapsed along with the Wehrmacht. Supplies were exhausted, personnel scattered, equipment abandoned or destroyed. Second, American medical doctrine emphasized speed, the golden hour concept. Getting wounded men from battlefield to surgery as quickly as possible saved lives. American ambulances, jeeps, and medical evacuation systems moved patients rapidly. German evacuation systems, in the chaos of defeat, no longer functioned. Third, American medical supplies made the difference. Sulfur drugs controlled infection, penicillin cured infections that developed, plasma treated shock, morphine controlled pain and prevented shock. Whole blood for transfusions saved patients who otherwise would have bled to death. German forces had virtually none of these resources by war's end. Colonel James Morrison, chief surgeon of the First Army, compiled statistics from multiple medical units. During the Ruhr operation, we treated approximately 6,000 German wounded requiring hospitalization. Of these, roughly 4,000 survived to be transferred to POW hospitals. That's a 67% survival rate for enemy wounded in American medical facilities. This compares favorably with our own casualty survival rates. These statistics reflected not just medical capability, but moral choice. American medical units could have provided minimal care to German wounded, enough to satisfy technical Geneva Convention compliance, while prioritizing every resource for American casualties. Instead, they provided equivalent care. This decision came from military medical doctrine, from personal ethics of medical personnel, and from American self-image as a nation that respected international law and human rights, even toward enemies. German medical officers who were themselves prisoners of war expressed astonishment at American medical capabilities. Oberstabsarzt Friedrich Schmidt, a Wehrmacht surgeon captured near Dortmund, was assigned to work in an American field hospital treating German wounded. The supplies, the equipment, the medications, I had not seen such abundance since 1941. American medical units operated at a level German military medicine had never achieved. Our wounded received better care from Americans than they would have from us. German prisoners who recovered from severe wounds often could not believe they had survived. They had expected to die from their injuries. In some cases, they had expected German military authorities to execute seriously wounded soldiers rather than burden units with their care, a practice that occurred in some SS units during the war's chaotic final weeks. Gefreiter Otto Braun, who suffered a severe abdominal wound, described his experience. "The American surgeon told me, through a translator, that I had a 50-50 chance. He operated for 3 hours. I woke up alive. He visited me the next day, told me I would recover. I could not believe it. I asked why he worked so hard to save an enemy. He said, 'You're not my enemy, you're my patient.'" The high survival rate created an unexpected challenge: what to do with thousands of recovered German wounded. They could not be released. The war was not yet over, and they remained prisoners of war. They could not all remain in American medical facilities, which needed beds for new casualties. The solution was transfer to prisoner of war hospitals in Ruhr areas, then eventually to POW camps. By mid-April, as the Ruhr Pocket collapsed and German resistance ended, American medical units began transferring recovered patients to designated POW hospitals. These facilities, established in formerly German hospitals and converted buildings, continued care under supervision of American medical officers and staffed partly by captured German medical personnel. The medical achievement in the Ruhr, treating and saving thousands of enemy wounded while simultaneously caring for American casualties, demonstrated American military medicine's capabilities and reflected American values of adhering to international law even in war's brutal closing weeks. April 10th through 15th. 1945, POW collection points and hospitals. Understanding the full significance of American medical treatment requires hearing from the German soldiers who experienced it. Their testimonies, collected during the war and in subsequent decades, reveal how profoundly this experience affected them. Many German soldiers had been indoctrinated with Nazi propaganda portraying Americans as brutal, lawless, and likely to massacre prisoners. This propaganda intensified in the war's final months as Nazi authorities tried to prevent surrenders. For wounded Germans who expected execution or abandonment, American medical care came as a profound shock. Unteroffizier Hans Dietrich, captured near Hagen with a shattered femur, later wrote about his experience. "I believed I would die. I had seen our own officers shoot severely wounded men rather than leave them behind. I expected the Americans would do the same. Instead, they gave me morphine for the pain, splinted my leg, transported me to a hospital. An American doctor performed surgery. A nurse, an American woman, cared for me. I could not reconcile this with what I had been told about Americans. The contrast between American treatment and German military practices devastated some prisoners' faith in Nazi ideology. If the Reich had lied about American brutality, what else had it lied about? For many young German soldiers, capture and subsequent medical care by Americans became the first step toward rejecting Nazi beliefs. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Schröder, 18 years old when captured, described his ideological crisis. "I had believed in the Führer, believed in Germany's cause. When American medics saved my life, I had to reconsider everything. These were the enemies I had been taught to hate, yet they showed me more humanity than my own officers had shown. I began to question all I had been told." Not all German prisoners experienced such dramatic conversions. Some remained committed Nazis, viewing American medical treatment as weakness or as propaganda designed to undermine German morale. These hardcore believers were a minority, but they existed in every POW hospital and camp. Interviews conducted by American military intelligence officers revealed the range of German attitudes. A report from the prisoner interrogation section noted, Most German POWs express surprise and gratitude for medical treatment received. They frequently contrast American medical care favorably with German military medicine's state by war's end. A small percentage remain hostile and view any American kindness as manipulation. Some German wounded had specific reasons to fear American captivity. Members of the Waffen-SS, particularly those from divisions implicated in atrocities, worried about reprisals. But even SS members received medical treatment according to standard protocols. Captain Morrison explained this policy. We treated SS prisoners the same as Wehrmacht prisoners medically. War crimes, investigations would come later. In the hospital, everyone was a patient. The gratitude expressed by many German prisoners sometimes made American medical personnel uncomfortable. Private First Class Anderson recalled, Germans would thank us, sometimes with tears in their eyes. One guy tried to kiss my hand. I was embarrassed. I didn't want their gratitude. I was just doing my job. But I guess from their perspective, we'd saved their lives when they expected to die. Some recovered German wounded volunteered to work in American medical facilities, assisting with care of other German patients. Captured German medical personnel, doctors, medics, nurses, were put to work under American supervision. This arrangement benefited everyone. American medical units gained additional personnel, German wounded received care from German-speaking staff, and German medical personnel fulfilled their calling. Oberstabsarzt Schmidt, the captured German surgeon mentioned earlier, worked in American medical facilities throughout April and into May. I operated under American supervision. They provided equipment, medications, and supplies I had not seen in years. Together we saved many lives, German lives, with American resources. This cooperation felt strange but necessary. Letters from German POWs to families in Germany, censored and monitored by American authorities, frequently mentioned medical treatment. A typical letter, I am wounded but recovering in an American hospital. The care is good. Do not worry. These letters contradicted Nazi propaganda about American brutality and contributed to the collapse of civilian morale in Germany. By April 15, 1945, as the Ruhr Pocket ceased to exist and nearly all surrounded German forces had surrendered, American medical units had treated thousands of German wounded. Most had survived. Most had been surprised by the quality of care. Many had fundamentally reassessed their understanding of the war and their enemy. April 12 through 15, 1945, throughout the collapsing Ruhr Pocket. The treatment of German wounded reached its climax during the Ruhr Pocket's final days. German resistance collapsed not in one dramatic moment, but in a cascading series of surrenders as units ran out of ammunition, food, and hope. By April 14th, American forces had split the pocket into eastern and western sections. The eastern section, smaller and more completely surrounded, surrendered the next day. The western section held out another few days, but organized resistance had effectively ended. Field Marshal Model, refusing to surrender personally, dissolved his command and ordered his men to make their own decisions about surrender. Model himself would commit suicide on April 21st rather than face capture. The flood of surrendering Germans overwhelmed American POW processing capabilities. Tens of thousands of men had to be searched, registered, fed, and moved to temporary enclosures. Among them were thousands of wounded who required immediate medical attention. American medical units worked at capacity and beyond, treating casualties from the final fighting while processing surrendered wounded. Major Philip Anderson, commanding a medical battalion supporting the 9th Army, described April 14th and 15th. Complete chaos. We had Americans coming in from the last fighting, Germans surrendering with wounds, civilians caught in crossfire, every surgeon was operating, every medic was working triage. We set up additional aid stations in captured buildings, commandeered German hospitals, established field hospitals in former German barracks. We treated everyone who came through the door. The scale was unprecedented. American medical units in the Ruhr region treated more enemy wounded in 2 weeks than they had treated in the previous 6 months of fighting. The 45th Evacuation Hospital statistics illustrate this. During February and March 1945, the hospital treated 37 German POWs. During the first 2 weeks of April, the hospital treated more than 300. This massive effort required all available medical resources. Supply officers worked day and night, requisitioning additional medications, bandages, plasma, and equipment. Medical personnel worked exhausting shifts, often sleeping a few hours, then returning to work. Support staff, cooks, drivers, clerks, guards, all worked overtime to support the medical mission. German wounded continued to arrive even after organized resistance ceased. Some had been hiding in rubble or forests for days, too weak to walk further. Others had been left behind by retreating units. American patrols found wounded Germans in cellars, barns, and roadside ditches and brought them to American medical facilities. Technical Sergeant Morrison, who had managed ambulance transportation earlier in the battle, described the final days. "We were running ambulances 24 hours. Drivers would grab a few hours' sleep in their vehicles, then back on the road. We were picking up Germans everywhere. Some had been wounded a week earlier, surviving somehow without treatment. The smell in some of those ambulances, gangrene, infected wounds, it was terrible. But we brought them in, and the docs did what they could. Not all German wounded survived. Some had gone too long without treatment. Infections had become systemic, beyond even penicillin's capabilities. Shock and blood loss had damaged organs irreversibly. These men died in American field hospitals, but they died with morphine for pain, with medical personnel trying to save them, rather than dying alone in ruins or forests. The medical response to the Ruhr Pocket operation represented American military medicine at its peak capability. The system that had been built over 4 years of war, the trained personnel, the medical doctrine, the logistics, the equipment, all functioned effectively, even under the stress of treating thousands of enemy wounded while continuing to care for American casualties. But beyond statistics and logistics, the Ruhr medical effort represented a moral statement. America could have provided minimal care to German wounded, enough to avoid clear Geneva Convention violations, while conserving resources for American forces. Instead, American medical units provided equivalent care, saving enemy lives at cost in resources and personnel. This decision reflected American values and American identity. The United States saw itself as a nation that respected international law, honored its commitments, and maintained civilized standards even in war's brutality. Treating enemy wounded according to the same standards as American wounded embodied these values. April 13th through 18th, 1945, medical facilities throughout the Ruhr region and beyond. As the dust settled on the Ruhr operation, medical officers compiled comprehensive statistics that revealed the extraordinary scope of the medical achievement. The numbers told a remarkable story. American medical units in the Ruhr region had treated approximately 6,000 German wounded requiring hospitalization during the 2-week battle. Of these, roughly 4,000, 67%, survived their initial injuries and hospitalization to be transferred to POW hospitals. This survival rate equaled or exceeded that of American wounded receiving similar treatment. For comparison, German military medical statistics from earlier in the war showed significantly lower survival rates for similarly severe wounds. The difference lay not in surgical skill. German military surgeons were highly trained, but in resources. By April 1945, German medical units lacked the supplies, medications, and functioning evacuation systems that American units possessed in abundance. The medical supply differential was stark. American medical units used sulfur drugs liberally on every wound. German medical units had exhausted their sulfur supplies months earlier. American surgeons had access to penicillin for treating infections. German surgeons had virtually no penicillin. American medical units had ample plasma for treating shock. German medical units had critically limited supplies. American ambulances moved wounded rapidly to surgical facilities. German evacuation systems had collapsed. Colonel Morrison, Chief Surgeon of the First Army, presented his findings in a comprehensive after-action report. Medical support during the Ruhr operation met all requirements despite treating significantly more enemy wounded than anticipated. The medical supply system, though strained, provided adequate resources. Personnel performed exceptionally under difficult conditions. Survival rates for both American and enemy wounded equaled or exceeded those of previous operations. The report noted several factors contributing to the high survival rate among German wounded. First, many German prisoners reached American medical care more quickly than they would have reached German medical facilities, even if those facilities had still been functioning. American forces controlled the battlefield, allowing rapid casualty evacuation. Second, the concentration of medical resources, multiple field hospitals, evacuation hospitals, and supporting units all operating in relatively close proximity, meant that specialized care was readily available. Third, the abundance of medical supplies meant that no patient went without necessary treatment due to shortages. The medical achievement had strategic implications beyond saving individual lives. The high survival rate among German wounded demonstrated American military capabilities to German soldiers still fighting. Word spread through German units that wounded men who surrendered received excellent medical care from Americans. This knowledge encouraged additional surrenders and reduced the intensity of last-ditch resistance. German medical officers who worked alongside Americans in treating German wounded gained first-hand knowledge of American medical capabilities. Oberstabsarzt Schmidt, the Wehrmacht surgeon who had worked under American supervision, later testified, The abundance of American medical resources was shocking to us. We had been told that American forces were overextended, that their supply lines were strained, that they faced shortages. Instead, we saw medical units operating with more supplies than German military medicine had possessed, even at the height of our military power. The statistical data from the Ruhr operation entered official U.S. Army Medical Department records and became part of post-war analyses of military medical effectiveness. Medical journals published articles examining the Ruhr medical operation, highlighting lessons learned and best practices. Several findings emerged that would influence future military medical doctrine. One key lesson was that adherence to Geneva Convention standards for treatment of enemy wounded was not only morally correct but operationally feasible even during intense combat. American medical units had demonstrated that providing equivalent care to enemy and friendly wounded did not compromise the medical support provided to American forces. Adequate planning, sufficient resources, and trained personnel made it possible to treat all wounded to the same high standard. Another lesson concerned the importance of speed in medical evacuation. The golden hour concept, getting wounded patients from point of injury to surgical care within 1 hour, proved crucial for survival. American medical units that consistently achieved rapid evacuation times saw higher survival rates than units where evacuation took longer. This finding would later influence the development of helicopter medical evacuation in the Korean War. A third lesson involved the value of abundant medical supplies, particularly newer medications like sulfur drugs and penicillin. The dramatic difference in infection rates between patients who received these medications and historical rates without them demonstrated that medical technology, when properly supplied, could dramatically improve outcomes. This reinforced the importance of maintaining robust medical supply chains, even during rapid offensive operations. By April 18th, when the last organized German resistance in the Ruhr ended, the medical statistics told a clear story. American military medicine had faced its greatest test, treating thousands of enemy wounded while supporting ongoing combat operations, and had met that test successfully. The achievement reflected not just medical capability but American values and the nation's commitment to maintaining civilized standards even during total war. April 14th through April 30th, 1945. As combat operations in Germany continued toward final victory, the treatment of German wounded during the Ruhr operation and throughout the European campaign's final weeks established precedents that would influence military medical ethics for decades to come. The decisions made by American medical personnel in April 1945 reflected values that extended beyond military necessity or international law compliance. Doctors, nurses, and medics who treated German wounded embodied principles of medical neutrality and human dignity that represented the best of American civilization. In choosing to provide equivalent care to enemy wounded, they made a moral statement about who America was and what America fought for. Father O'Malley, the chaplain who had wrestled with the theological implications of treating enemy wounded, reflected on the moral dimensions in a letter written April 25, 1945. "We have seen unspeakable evil. The concentration camps that our forces have liberated show the depths of Nazi depravity and the horror of which humans are capable. Yet we have also seen young American medics risk their lives to save wounded Germans, giving morphine to ease pain, performing surgery to save lives, offering compassion to men who fought against us. This contrast defines what we are fighting for. We fight to defeat evil, but we fight as a civilized nation that maintains its principles even toward its enemies. This is what separates us from the enemy." The liberation of concentration camps in April 1945 created intense moral tensions for medical personnel. Soldiers and medics who witnessed the horrors of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen found it difficult to reconcile those atrocities with their mission to treat German wounded. The knowledge that Nazi Germany had murdered millions in systematic genocide while American forces saved German lives created profound moral complexity. Captain Thompson, the surgeon who had operated on hundreds of German wounded during the Ruhr operation, visited Buchenwald concentration camp shortly after its liberation on April 11th. His experience there shook him deeply. In his diary, he wrote, "What I saw at Buchenwald defies description. The skeletal survivors, the mass graves, the crematoria, the evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale. It represents evil beyond anything I imagined possible. When I returned to my hospital and saw German patients recovering from surgery, I had to remind myself these individual soldiers, most of them teenagers or old men, did not run Buchenwald, most probably did not know it existed. The crimes of their government and their military leadership do not justify abandoning my medical oath or ceasing to treat the wounded. I will continue doing my job. War crimes tribunals will handle justice for the guilty." Not everyone agreed with this distinction between individual German soldiers and the Nazi regime's crimes. Some American soldiers and medical personnel believed that all Germans bore collective guilt for the Holocaust and other Nazi atrocities, and therefore deserved no mercy or special consideration. These views remained minority opinions among medical personnel, who generally maintained professional standards despite personal feelings. The post-war period would test these principles further. Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, did not end the need for medical care of German wounded. Thousands of German soldiers remained hospitalized with wounds received in the war's final weeks. American medical facilities in occupied Germany continued treating German patients for months after the war's end, gradually transferring responsibility to rehabilitated German medical facilities. This continued medical cooperation helped establish the foundation for post-war German-American relations. Many Germans who later supported democratic reconstruction of West Germany and cooperation with American occupation authorities had first experienced American values through medical treatment as wounded prisoners of war. Their testimony about American humanity and professionalism countered Soviet propaganda that portrayed Americans as brutal occupiers. The Ruhr operations medical component became a case study taught in American military medical schools and courses on Geneva Convention compliance. It demonstrated that maintaining humanitarian standards toward enemy wounded was not only morally correct, but operationally feasible and strategically advantageous. The lessons learned influenced American military medical doctrine during the Cold War era and in subsequent conflicts. Modern American military medical personnel still learn about World War II medical operations, including the treatment of enemy wounded during the Ruhr campaign. The principles established then, that medical personnel treat wounded patients regardless of nationality, that adequate resources must be allocated to comply with Geneva Convention requirements, that speed of evacuation determines survival rates, remain central to American military medical doctrine today. The moral legacy extends beyond military medicine. The American decision to treat German wounded according to the same standards as American wounded represented a broader commitment to maintaining civilized values even during total war against a barbaric enemy. Nazi Germany had violated every principle of civilized warfare, had murdered millions in concentration camps, had brought unprecedented evil into the world. Yet American forces responding to this evil maintained their principles and their humanity. This distinction mattered in the post-war world and continues to matter in defining what America represents. May through December 1945, occupied Germany and beyond. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. But the medical care of German wounded continued for months thereafter, and the implications of American medical treatment extended far beyond the immediate post-war period. American military authorities faced questions about how long the United States would continue providing medical care to former enemy soldiers. The Geneva Convention required medical care for prisoners of war, but technically these men were no longer POWs after Germany's surrender. They were disarmed enemy forces in occupied territory. Did the United States still have legal obligations to treat them? And if so, for how long? The decision was made at the highest levels of American military and political leadership. American forces would continue providing necessary medical care to German wounded until German medical facilities could assume responsibility. This policy reflected both humanitarian concern and practical necessity. Discharging thousands of severely wounded men without proper follow-up care would have created a humanitarian crisis in already devastated Germany and could have undermined efforts to establish stable occupation governance. American medical units in occupied Germany established a systematic transition process. German hospitals, many damaged by bombing but still functional, were rehabilitated and staffed by German medical personnel under American supervision. German wounded recovering in American hospitals were gradually transferred to these German facilities as they became operational. American medical officers conducted regular inspections of German hospitals to ensure adequate standards of care were maintained. This transition period lasted through late 1945 and into 1946. Throughout this time, American military medicine maintained ultimate responsibility for ensuring that German wounded received proper care. The system worked reasonably well, though shortages of medical supplies and damage to German medical infrastructure created ongoing challenges. The experience of treating German wounded profoundly influenced many American medical officers who later held leadership positions in military and civilian medicine. Colonel Morrison, who had supervised medical operations during the Ruhr battle, later rose to the rank of general and served as Army Surgeon General from 1953 to 1959. His experiences in Germany shaped his approach to military medical ethics, Geneva Convention compliance, and the importance of maintaining humanitarian standards during conflict. Many individual American medical personnel maintained personal connections with German patients they had treated. Letters were exchanged, and occasionally visits were arranged as travel between the United States and Germany became possible in the early 1950s. These personal connections represented reconciliation at the individual level, former enemies connected by shared experiences of suffering and healing. One particularly remarkable story involved Technical Sergeant Miller, the surgical technician from the 45th Evacuation Hospital, and Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann, the German soldier whose life Miller had helped save. In 1948, Zimmermann, who had survived his wounds and rebuilt his life in post-war Germany, wrote to American military authorities trying to locate the surgical team that had treated him. He wanted to express his gratitude directly. American authorities forwarded his letter to Miller, who had returned to civilian life in Ohio. Miller responded, beginning a correspondence that lasted for years. In 1955, Miller traveled to Germany and met Zimmermann in person. For the first time since April 1945, Zimmermann introduced Miller to his wife and children, a family that existed because an American surgical team had saved Zimmermann's life during the final days of the war. The two men remained friends until Zimmermann's death in 1983. Miller spoke at memorial services held in Zimmermann's honor, testifying to the power of medical mercy to transcend the hatreds of war. Such stories were not unique. Across Germany, thousands of men lived in the post-war years who would have died without American medical intervention in April and May 1945. Their survival contributed directly to German post-war reconstruction. Germany desperately needed workers, fathers, citizens to rebuild from the devastation of total war. The German wounded, treated by American medical units, became part of that rebuilding effort. The strategic implications of American medical treatment of German wounded extended well beyond Germany. American adherence to Geneva Convention standards during World War II strengthened international humanitarian law and provided evidence that the conventions could be followed even during the most intense combat. When the Geneva Conventions were comprehensively revised and expanded in 1949, American representatives at the diplomatic conference cited wartime experiences, including the treatment of German wounded during the Ruhr operation, as practical examples demonstrating that humanitarian standards were achievable. The 1949 Geneva Conventions, which remain the foundation of international humanitarian law today, incorporated lessons learned from World War II. The expanded protections for wounded prisoners of war, the detailed requirements for medical care, and the strengthened enforcement mechanisms all reflected the belief that nations could and should maintain humanitarian standards during armed conflict. American compliance during World War II helped make this argument credible. 1945 through the present, the legacy of American medical treatment of German wounded during World War II. The story of American medics treating German wounded in April 1945 represents far more than a footnote to military history. It illuminates fundamental questions about humanity, morality, and civilized conduct during warfare that remain relevant today. The young American medics who treated German wounded in the Ruhr Pocket were not philosophers or ethicists. Most were teenagers or men in their early 20s. Many with no medical training before joining the army. They came from small towns and big cities across America, representing every region, religion, and ethnic background. They faced extreme conditions: combat stress, resource limitations, physical exhaustion, moral complexity. Yet they maintained professional standards and treated enemy wounded as human beings worthy of medical care. Their motivations came from multiple sources that reinforced each other. Military orders required Geneva Convention compliance, providing clear institutional support for treating enemy wounded. Medical ethics, taught during their training, demanded treating all patients regardless of other considerations. American cultural values emphasized respect for human life and dignity, even toward enemies. Religious faith, which sustained many through the war's horrors, taught that all humans were created in God's image and deserved compassion. Personal character and individual conscience made most American medical personnel unwilling to let anyone suffer unnecessarily when they possessed the ability to help. The German soldiers who received this treatment never forgot it. Obergefreiter Zimmermann expressed what many felt in his 1948 letter: "You saved my life when you had every reason not to save me. You treated me with dignity when I expected contempt. You showed me mercy when I anticipated none. This act of humanity taught me more about true civilization than years of Nazi propaganda ever could. I owe my life to American medics who saw me not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a wounded human being who needed help. The statistical record provides one measure of the achievement. American medical units treated approximately 6,000 German wounded requiring hospitalization. During the Ruhr operation alone, survival rates for German wounded in American medical care equaled those for American wounded, approximately 65% for the most seriously injured. Tens of thousands of additional German wounded received American medical treatment during World War II's final months across all combat zones in Germany. Most survived, most returned to their families after the war, most helped rebuild post-war Germany. But statistics cannot fully capture the human dimension of this story. Each survival represented an individual life saved. A husband who returned to his wife, a father who watched his children grow, a son whose mother did not have to bury him. Each German soldier treated by American medics had a story, a family, a future that existed because young American medical personnel chose mercy over vengeance, professional duty over personal hatred, civilized values over wartime brutality. The moral dimension of this story extends beyond individual acts of mercy to fundamental questions about national character and values. American medical treatment of German wounded demonstrated that civilized nations could maintain humanitarian standards even during total war against enemies who had committed unprecedented atrocities. Nazi Germany had violated every principle of civilized warfare, had murdered 6 million Jews and millions of others in systematic genocide, had brought evil into the world on a scale never before seen. Yet American forces, while fighting to destroy Nazi Germany militarily, maintained their own moral principles and treated individual German soldiers humanely. This distinction mattered profoundly in the post-war world. American moral credibility in occupied Germany and throughout Europe rested partly on how American forces had conducted themselves during combat. German civilians and soldiers knew that American troops had treated German wounded according to Geneva Convention standards, had maintained military discipline, had punished American soldiers who committed atrocities, and had generally behaved as a civilized army rather than as conquerors seeking revenge. This knowledge facilitated American occupation policies and made German acceptance of American-style democracy more palatable. The legacy of American World War II medical operations continues to influence American military medicine today. The principles established during World War II that medical personnel treat wounded patients regardless of nationality or allegiance, that adequate resources must be allocated to comply with international humanitarian law, that speed of medical evacuation determines survival rates, that maintaining medical ethics, even under combat stress, is essential, remain central to American military medical doctrine in the 21st century. Modern American military medics and medical personnel continue this tradition in contemporary conflicts. During operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, American medical facilities treated wounded insurgents according to the same protocols and standards as American and Allied forces wounded. These decisions sometimes generated controversy and criticism from those who questioned why enemy fighters should receive American medical care. The response from military medical personnel echoed what Captain Thompson said in April 1945, "I'm a doctor, I treat patients. Medical ethics don't distinguish between friend and enemy when both are wounded and need care." The story of American medics treating German wounded in the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945 reminds us that even in war's darkest moments, humanity can prevail over hatred, mercy can triumph over vengeance, and civilization can survive even civilization's worst conflicts. Young men from America, who had every reason to hate their enemies after years of brutal combat, chose instead to honor their medical obligations and their humanity. They saved lives when they could have allowed death. They showed compassion when they could have shown cruelty. They proved that a nation could fight a total war against evil while maintaining its own moral principles and values. In the ruins of the Ruhr, in April 1945, this principle manifested in American medics giving morphine to ease the pain of wounded Germans, in surgeons operating for hours to save enemy lives, in nurses providing comfort to patients who had fought against America just days earlier. These acts of medical mercy did not end the war. American military power accomplished that. But these acts defined what America stood for, what values America defended, and what kind of nation America would be in victory and in the post-war world that followed. The German wounded who survived to see their families again, to rebuild their lives in post-war Germany, to tell their stories to children and grandchildren, they became living testimony to American values and American character. Their survival proved that America fought World War II not to destroy Germany or Germans, but to defeat Nazi evil people and establish a better, more peaceful world based on democratic values and respect for human rights. In that better world, even former enemies could live and prosper because young American medics in April 1945 believed that every wounded human being, regardless of nationality or past actions, deserved medical care and a chance at survival. This story deserves to be remembered and honored. It represents the best of American values and American character during history's greatest conflict. If you value factual historical accounts that honor the memory of those who served while exploring the complex moral dimensions of warfare, consider supporting educational efforts to preserve these stories and ensure that future generations understand both the costs of war and the enduring importance of maintaining humanity and civilized values even in war's darkest hours.